So, time to start our last session for the day. So, I am delighted to welcome you on this World Refugee Day to a discussion on disability rights in the global migration crisis. So, as you know, we heard yesterday a very sophisticated theoretical analysis of intersectionality from Professor Mary Romero. We also heard a very touching life experience from Eleanor Lisney. Eleanor noted that intersectionality means always being the other, a feeling of not being accepted by many communities you could participate in and engage meaningfully with others. So let's discuss today another area of artificial borders we draw between us, the area of physical borders. So all the borders we draw between us and all distinctions are artificial. But this is all the more the case for real territory borders to the free circulation of humanity. As Jeremy Waldron has noted recently, a very important legal philosopher, humanity is characterized by a dialectic of movement and settlement. Our nature is characterized by wandering and settlement at the same time. So let's try to think in this panel and during this discussion, what happens when intersectionality meets another factor of exclusion, not being a member of a political or a national community. So we will focus on the migration crisis with two experts with remarkable experience in this area, Emina Cerimovic and Roberto Placordero. Let me briefly present them to you. Emina conducts research and advocacy on human rights abuses against persons with disabilities and works on issues related to migration. She has investigated police abuse of migrants and asylum seekers in Serbia and Macedonia and has researched abuses against refugees with disabilities in Greece. Emina holds a law degree from the University of Sarajevo and an LLM degree in human rights with a specialization in EU law from the Central European University in Budapest. Then we will hear from Ricardo Placordero. Ricardo works at the IRC as risk mitigation and inclusion advisor. As development and humanitarian worker, he has designed, implemented, monitored, and evaluated rights-based approach programs in humanitarian crises, such as the Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, the earthquakes in Nepal in 2015, and the Syrian crisis, analyzing how responses ensure equitable access for persons with disabilities to essential humanitarian aid and promote dignity, safety, participation, and accountability. Ricardo collaborates also in the development of global policy and guidance to promote the rights of persons with disabilities, such as the Charter and IASC guidelines on inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action, UNICEF's guidance on including children with disabilities in humanitarian action, and the humanitarian inclusion standards for older people and people with disabilities. So we start with Emina first.
I'm sorry. It's a true pleasure to be here. I've always wanted to attend the summer school ever since I was in law school myself. So my name is Emina Cerimovic, and I work as a researcher with the Disability Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. So Human Rights Watch is an international non-profit organization that works on documenting and advocating in the human rights field, and we are the only major international human rights organization that has a division on the rights of people with disabilities, where half of our staff are people with disabilities themselves. So I've been working on the situation of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants for many years, and I've been working on the situation of people with disabilities in conflicts and refugee situations for the last 2 years. Just some statistics to start with. As you know, that persons with disabilities There are around like 80% of them live in developing countries, and they comprise approximately 1 billion people worldwide. 2 days ago, the UNHCR actually published new statistics about people who are displaced. So this figure of 65 million people is not correct anymore. But what we don't know is how many of the 68 million people who are displaced are refugees, asylum seekers, are migrants, are people with disabilities. So I know this is end of the day, and you have already heard many presentations. So I was hoping to make this a little bit interactive, to make it more interesting to you and to everyone here. So I had a question for all of you. So if you could think, we are taking a step back from the migration crisis, and we're thinking about a conflict. So I want you to think about a conflict in a particular country, and just consider, if you can, in 2 words, tell us what you think happens to those who have a disability. Is there anyone? Yes, please.
Most people would be ignored, most people with disabilities. However, if they had someone supporting them, that person would advocate to take them. They might be very old. Their disability might be invisible. They may have psychosocial difficulties. They may be terrified. They may be physically ill. All this is not obvious to the officials at the borders. And I'm speaking from about recent events.
Okay.
Thousands of people have drowned now in the Mediterranean. Some were able to land in Italy. If they landed in Italy, until a few weeks ago, they would have been looked after very well. But there is now a new government in Italy which is anti-immigration. You get my point. Mm-hmm. What we need to aim for in this meeting is exactly what you want. People with disabilities in conflict and emergency settings deserve, at the very least, reasonable accommodation. You can't expect the border guards, the border police,
so we will have,
overwhelmed by people to cope on their own.
Excuse me. So we will have an opportunity to discuss this in more detail later. But what I would appreciate if we all could focus on just 2 things to mention, like what happens to people with disabilities. Think about it. What happens to them when conflict occurs? So one is that they are ignored. What are the other 2 things, or one thing?
Yeah, it will be a terrible situation for them. Some will lose their life, and really helpless, of course, in such situation.
Over there.
Sometimes during conflict, the family or community structures break down, so their support network might break down as well.
So let me tell, so I was a child during the Bosnian War, and I lived through the Bosnian War for 5 years. And some of the people I knew lived in high buildings with 13 floors. And there was no electricity, so elevators didn't work. And when there was shelling, all of us would run down to the basement to hide from the shelling. People with disabilities who used wheelchair could not flee. So that's just thinking about, can people with disabilities flee in case of conflict? Are there any other thoughts? Stephanie? Just wait for the mic, please.
Stephanie Rodoleva from Women Enabled International. One very important dimension, as we often talked about here today, is the intersectional dimensions. And of course, disabled women, like many other women in conflict situations, are often subjected to gender-based violence and rape. Mm-hmm. And this is often worse for disabled women because of their loss of family connections and support networks, but also the fact that programs are not accessible to them.
Mm-hmm. No, all these are really good points. And what I thought we could also do now is to watch a short video, which will tell you about some of the issues that we have discussed. And then we can, so can we open this video? Yeah. So the video, the name is Leave No One Behind, Persons with Disabilities in Crisis. Can we play it? Oh. back, look on it. I don't know how to use. Oh, here.
It's your presentation.
Yes.
The war, everything became difficult. Going to school, getting treatment, or going anywhere is difficult.
Indiscriminate attacks in Yemen killed thousands of civilians. Many of the 3 million people with disabilities are virtually imprisoned in their homes.
Because of the war and my condition, I'm not able.
7 million people with disabilities are displaced by war, persecution, or generalized violence. They are especially at risk in crises. Leave no one behind. Persons with disabilities in crises. Mohammed, an 18-year-old Syrian refugee, now lives in Germany. He lost his legs in a Syrian airstrike. In 2015, he sought refuge in Europe.
We risked our lives in the rubber boat, but we made it to Greece. My cousin carried me all the way to Turkey. We tried to do the impossible, bring him to Germany no matter what it takes.
People with disabilities face added risks of abandonment, neglect, and lack access to food, healthcare, and education. Hind has a visual disability and lives in war-torn Yemen.
My life was completely changed by the war. Everything became difficult. Going to school, getting treatment, or going anywhere is difficult.
Indiscriminate attacks in Yemen killed thousands of civilians. Many of the 3 million people with disabilities are virtually imprisoned in their homes.
Because of the war and my condition, I'm not able to go out anymore.
Amboise was displaced by deadly sectarian violence in the Central African Republic.
The rebels killed people like it was nothing. They beat people. People were suffering. My whole family fled our home. I was alone in the house. A kid had just passed by. I said, please help me. If you leave me, I will die. He carried me on his back 2-3 kilometers to the camp.
People with disabilities continue to face unique challenges in meeting their most basic needs, even after they flee to safety.
Here, it's different than home. Even to get soap to wash our clothes isn't easy. You see how dirty I am from my pants to my feet.
Samplice lives in the same camp as Amboise. He was a professor of French literature before the conflict.
We, people with disabilities, have trouble getting around to find something to eat. In the camp, there are enormous difficulties because, as you know, people with disabilities are often forgotten.
Kauthar, a Syrian refugee in Lebanon, struggles to get accessible education for her son, Wa'el. He has physical and intellectual disabilities resulting from Hunter syndrome.
He failed a grade at school. Now he's in the same grade as his younger brother. No one at school would give him special care because of his condition. His only weapon is education.
I like school. I love to read. I love going to school. It is the most important thing.
I have a nightmare about his future. In my dream, I see my son sitting in a corner and not doing anything at all. Nothing at all.
When this conflict began, we, people with disabilities, we stuck together.
A national para-basketball team in the Central African Republic.
We all share the experience of living with disabilities. That powerful bond has made us like a family.
Governments, the UN, aid agencies, and donors should ensure that people with disabilities are included in humanitarian response. And persons with disabilities and their representative organizations should be part of the decision-making, planning, and monitoring in the spirit of nothing about us without us. Leave no one behind.
So this is a video that Human Rights Watch produced ahead of the World Humanitarian Summit that Ricardo is going to talk a little bit about later. But going back to what happens to people with disabilities when conflict occurs is that what we have documented by speaking to people with disabilities and their families is that they are often left behind. There are several reasons for why they're left behind, and often their family members do face a dilemma of whether to stay and to provide the support to a person with disabilities or to flee and save themselves. I wanted to tell you a story of Hamutu, who we met in Central African Republic. She is a 14-year-old girl with polio. I'm showing her picture on the screen, and she's sitting in front of a shelter where we met her. There are two crutches next to her and a wheelchair in the background. So Hamutu told us when anti-Balaka rebels attacked her village in early 2014, she had no way to run. Her older brother tried to carry her on his back, but soon he got too exhausted. So she told him, "Suleiman, put me down and save yourself." He told her he would come back to get her in case he doesn't get killed. Suleiman never returned, and Hamutu spent 2 weeks abandoned by the river. Then the anti-Balaka fighters found her. When they saw that she couldn't walk, the fighters decided to kill her. They said, "We have found an animal, let's finish it off." Luckily, a female fighter intervened to save her life. What we have documented throughout our work in Central African Republic and South Sudan is that people with disabilities are often left behind, including also older people, something that was not discussed this morning, but we did discuss the situation of older people as well. And what was also interesting was to document that many people believe that the rebels would have some kind of mercy towards people with disabilities. And that's why some family members decided to leave them behind. However, they were killed on spots. The killers sometimes showed extreme cruelty towards women with disabilities. One young pregnant woman with a disability was tied up and thrown alive on a fire by the Seleka fighters. She suffered a horrible death. You could see in the video that we also spoke about what happens to people with disabilities when they do reach safety, when they do reach a refugee camp. And what we have documented over and over again, not only in Central African Republic and South Sudan in the camps for internally displaced people, but also in Greece, is that people with disabilities are once again left behind. They can't even access the basic needs. The camps often do not have toilets and showers that are accessible to people with disabilities. And in Central African Republic, we documented how many people with disabilities had to crawl down on the ground to access toilets. In some cases, they couldn't use them at all. I'm showing a picture of Ali. Ali is a 22-year-old refugee from Afghanistan that I met in Greece on Lesbos, the island of Lesbos. On the picture, he's sitting in his wheelchair, facing the ocean and throwing a rock. When I met Ali, I met him in a horrifying camp called Moria, where more than 5,000 people lived last year. And I went there and I saw that every single toilet and every single shower had steps for entering. And so I asked Ali, how do you use toilets and how do you use showers? And he told me that he hadn't taken a shower in 3 months because they're not accessible to him. What also Ali told me is that the abuse go beyond what happens in the conflict itself and once people reach refugee. He told me that before boarding the boat from Turkey to Greece, the smugglers made him give up on his wheelchair. So I asked him, what did it mean to you? How did it make you feel? He told me, how would it make you feel if someone told you to leave your feet behind? Wheelchairs are my feet. I also met Ali. So I'm showing a picture of an Afghan family that I met in Athens. And Ali is an 8-year-old boy with intellectual and physical disabilities. You might not be able to see it on the picture, but he's sitting in a wheelchair that's too big for him. So what we also documented was that people with disabilities, once they also reach refugee camps, they either don't have access to assistive devices, or they do, but those assistive devices are not appropriate for them. Even worse, what Ali's parent told me really broke my heart. Ali was a person who could walk when he first got to Greece, but because of the difficult conditions in the camp, his condition deteriorated. Not only did it deteriorate, but because toilets inside of the camp are not accessible to people with disabilities, Ali, at age of 8, was put back in diapers. Also, in addition to having an intellectual and physical disabilities, Ali's parents told me that he has a lot of fear, that he often gets distressed, especially when there is a lot of noise. And when I met him, he lived in a camp of 3,000 people. So can you imagine that there is always some noise? And he had no access to psychosocial support to help him with the fears he had. And so what we documented, and here especially I want to talk about Greece because it's an EU member state. So what we especially documented was that refugees with disabilities did not have access to basic needs such as shelter, sanitation, medical care. Another thing is that the Greek authorities, they have a responsibility to identify anyone who has a disability. Over and over again, we would document how people with disabilities were not identified, especially those with invisible disabilities. And what we documented to be the case in particular is lack of access to much needed mental health care and psychosocial support for refugees with trauma, anxiety, and depression. And this is something that really resonates with me. I was a child during the Bosnian War, and I escaped at the very end of the war with my mother and my sister. And I was a refugee in Sweden, and I can personally attest that the trauma of fleeing a war, losing your family members, going hungry, these feelings never really fade away. And now I have insomnia, I have anxiety, I have PTSD, and it was really painful to be in Greece to document that the mental health of refugees who live there are compounded by the conditions inside of the camps. And what I want to, because I have only a few minutes left, what I want to end with is the devastating fact was that 2 years ago, when I first reached out to 8 international humanitarian organizations in Greece, including the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, I reached out to them by simple email. I would like to speak with you about the situation of people with disabilities in Greece, about refugees with disabilities in Greece. 8 of them, all of them, responded similarly to my request. They said, we don't really focus on people with disabilities. So because I don't have much time. I want to tell you also about impact. Earlier we spoke about resilience, and we spoke about how do we make sure that our mental health, for those of us who advocate and who do research, is taken care of. And nothing is more rewarding than when we have impact. We advocated and we spoke, we testified before the European Parliament, because the European Parliament, the EU actually as itself, has given more than 300 million euros to Greece to assess the situation of refugees. Why are people with disabilities forgotten when we are talking about such a huge amount? So we testified together with Nadine Mustafa, who is an incredible advocate from Syria, who fled Syria in wheelchair, before the European Parliament, and we had Christos Stylianides, who is the Commissioner for the European Union's humanitarian aid, request that all humanitarian partners, meaning that like Doctors Without Borders, Norwegian Refugee Council, Danish Refugee Councils, all of them, whoever receives money from the European Union, has to include people with disabilities in the protection and services they provide. Not only do they have to include persons with disabilities, but they also have to report on how they are doing that. So that's quite some impact. And I think I will leave it on that. I have 2 more minutes, good. I will use these 2 minutes to talk again a little bit more about the mental health, because I think, and people with psychosocial disabilities, because I think we haven't really spoken a lot about it today in other sessions. And so what we documented in Greece in particular was, we're talking about people who have experienced extreme trauma back in their home countries and during fleeing. But what we have documented is that the horrifying conditions they're finding themselves in now in Greece are actually compounding their mental health and are actually causing them psychological harm. And the problem is that psychological harm is not as visible as physical injuries, so people don't really care. But what we have documented by talking to Doctors Without Borders, Doctors of the World, lawyers and activists, and to the people themselves, is a significant increase of incidents of self-harm, suicidal attempts, aggression, anxiety, and depression. And it's been really, and it's something that's often forgotten. And again, when we talk about intersectionality, when we talk about disability and migration, we also have to talk about mental health. So I think I will leave it at that. Thank you.
We'll use a chronometer to be sure that I'm not taking too much time. I can start already saying thanks to Emina for the presentation, for setting the background. I have started very recently working with the IRC. I was working beforehand with Humanitarian Inclusion, that was previously called Handicap International. I will be using also a presentation that I will be describing because it was sent late. Apologies for that. I have to start recognizing, for example, that I have a picture in the cover, which I can describe. It's a girl with a disability, probably in Satari camp, but I don't have her name, actually, and I apologize, and I feel very sorry for that, because I couldn't access the credits for the picture, right? And this is one of the things that we can start, let's say, pinpointing, and is how accessing information within mainstream organizations can be challenging. I draft some learning questions to understand what is happening with the humanitarian system and how is it responding or not to what Emina has been describing now. So how social change is impacting humanitarian contexts, I think is something Emina has described very well, but are humanitarian frameworks and policies reflecting that change and intersectionality? I will focus specifically on intersectionality because it's the topic of this course, but also because it may be one of the solutions of the problem. And then, well, is the humanitarian system changing, and how? The objectives, what I would like to provoke or share with you would be, well, first, having an increased awareness on what is going on. So evidence, approaches, initiatives, guidance, policy development related to intersectionality and including disabilities and social change in humanitarian action. And then call for action. I think that I would like to be in the capacity to inspire you to address research, capacity, policy gaps as regards to inclusion of persons with disabilities if you cannot address other direct issues because you are perhaps involved directly in your country in this issue. I will start from the evidence. So as Emina was sharing, humanitarian action, it has to be informed, right? There has to be some evidence. I have selected some extracts from different real documents that I would like to comment with you. First, it's a random selection, I have to say, but I think it's representative enough. International Migration Report, 2017. The migration report says that there's 258 million people living in a country other than their country of birth. That means that this is an increase of 49% since 2000. We have the number of refugees that was shared by Mina, but we have also migrants, including economic migrants. What happens? Within that same report, we find this paragraph. The special needs of people in vulnerable situations traveling as part of large movements of refugees and migrants, including women at risk, children, and obvious long paragraphs of categories, persons with disabilities, and it continues. Keep that in your mind. Second, Humanitarian Needs Overview, Syria 2017. So humanitarian needs overviews are documents that are developed every year and they are collaborative. Many agencies are contributing with information they have from the field, from their data collection, from their monitoring, and they are sharing it with the Office for the Coordination of the Humanitarian Affairs, who develop this report yearly, which is going to mobilize all a series of actions, including resource mobilization, so funding, that is going to answer to the needs that are identified here. And I highlight already needs again. Extract from a paragraph from there, the elderly and persons with disabilities and mental health disorders, particularly those with insufficient family and community support, are at increased risk of social exclusion, poverty, and violence due to limited mobility, discrimination, and a lack of availability of services designed to meet their specific needs. Try to remember the reactions that you're having. We are going to see a third one. Is the Humanitarian Needs Overview, Syria, same country, 2018. We have a small change. There is a breakdown of people in need, 2.9 million people with disabilities. We have specific data, estimations. People with chronic diseases, people with chronic illness, disabilities, and injuries have specific needs, which cut across sectors and may face difficulties in accessing needed assistance. Now I want to ask back to the floor. Do you consider that this, do you consider that what I've been reading reflects a human rights-based approach of intersectionality? Raise your hand to say yes, it reflects. Okay, I don't see any hand. Oh, there's one. Yes, can you say why? Very briefly with a mic, please. Thanks. Gentleman with glasses in the back.
It's just sort of the feeling I get that like human rights, like it is a big issue with human rights and war crimes, kind of genocide, and how that affects disabled people.
Okay, so we have persons with disabilities are reflected, are mentioned at least. That is a positive point, right? But perhaps some of the answers, we will see them later, but most of you were not in agreement, right? You didn't consider that this was reflecting a human rights-based approach to intersectionality. I would like to move ahead because we don't have a lot of time, but we will discuss that later. But the question is that, I said, humanitarian needs overviews through a channel of different actions, including resource mobilization, informs programming, so answers from humanitarian stakeholders. What happens that, well, we have I think it's a very recommended paper from the Women Refugee Commission, WRC, in 2017 around Syria, and I am displaying some of the findings. Well, persons with disabilities are considered first as a homogeneous at-risk group. We are not considering any kind of diversity within that group. Second, intersecting factors such as age, gender, place of origin are not considered. In programming, they did a comprehensive study, sorry for not introducing that, to all programming, or a quite good number of programming around the Syrian crisis, and not only in Syria, but Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey. Last finding, resilience was not considered. Just a small example while I am displaying the cover, or that says implications, so vulnerability and resilience-based approaches as response to the Syrian crisis, implications for women, children, and youth with disabilities, with a picture of 2 women with disabilities. The issue is that, for example, one of the cases that was shared is as regards to livelihoods and cash-based interventions, where cash is distributed directly to the population. Persons with disabilities were mentioned only as regards to their vulnerability, so they were part of a vulnerability scoring system within the household, within the family. If there is a person with disability, then the scoring was higher. But that was all. That means there were not additional accommodations, additional instructions on, first, where the money would go to the person, would go to the family, what for? Was the system to distribute that cash accessible or not? Was decision-making, was use of money made also accessible or inclusive or owned by the person with disability? No information on that. That means resilience and capacities of persons with disabilities were not considered at all. Well, some of the key issues you've seen already, right? Humanitarian programming and funding is based on needs. This is the wording that is constantly used in humanitarian programming. Numbers of people in need, that comes already from all guidelines, and we are going to see some of them today, that humanitarian actors receive as a guidance. Second, well, estimations are often used because there's a lack of disaggregated data. We will discuss a little bit later that point too. And third, there's a lot of use of categories and categorizations. So that means groups that are always conceived in a homogeneous way and as non-intersecting, and then using, of course, stigmatizing terminology. So where is the gap? I'm going to now use a small assumption that may be wrong, and we can discuss also later. But so I'm representing a pyramid. On the top of the pyramid, we have law. I assume that law should be informing policy. That means policy efforts that are non-legally binding, but are initiatives that governments and other stakeholders, including humanitarian stakeholders, including also organizations of persons with disabilities, are undertaking on a voluntary basis to change certain situations, right? Political commitment, we could say. Third would be guidance, that policy needs to be transformed into something more tangible, because humanitarian stakeholders don't read policy. We need to accept that. But finally, then you need to go to work with something, and it's a tool. Okay, that is the pyramid that I have depicted. Let's go quickly through all. So law, well, first, the CRPD, and more in particular, which article, if I may ask quickly? 11, which is long or short? Very short, right? One of the shorter, someone was complaining before about short articles. Article 11 is very short, it's just one paragraph, and refers to other, and I won't read it to save time, but refers to other legal frameworks, and actually, and thanks to Janet Lore, who developed a desk review on this for a work that I will mention later on guidance. The CRPD Article 11, which refers only to situations of emergency and disasters, informs other bodies of law, such as international humanitarian law, international human rights law, refugee law, international criminal law, and international environmental law. Okay? So the legal framework is quite big. Then, if you're interested in knowing in more detail how each of these framework actually considers persons with disabilities, I invite you to read the desk review that we can share through the resources, and I forgot to send that, apologies also. But, well, we have a comprehensive legal framework, I can say 10 minutes. Key issues, first, well, Article 11 is one of the shorter articles, so guidance, it cannot be easily providing policy and guidance. That is an assumption I have. Second, humanitarian actors, as I said, they are not very familiar with CRPD and other conventions. We have to be sincere. But then, which are the frameworks that are guiding humanitarian actors? Third, DPOs are not always involved, not always even welcome, involved in a meaningful way in humanitarian issues. And as a result, one of the results, well, apart of interventions not being inclusive, we don't know actually what is happening, because reporting in Article 11 is very scarce. Which is the potential for change? And I will be dropping these small pills to represent a little bit what I said, how the humanitarian system changes. One of the potential for change, hopefully, is that the guidance note on CRPD Article 11 reporting is being currently developed. It's an effort that is being undertaken by the International Disability Alliance, CBM, and HI as a joint effort. In terms of policy, well, first, humanitarian principles. Have you ever heard of humanitarian principles? Yes, raise your hands. Yes, some people have heard. So, oh, sorry, I was too fast. There are 4: humanity, neutrality, impartiality, independence. Which ones would you point at if you had to speak about intersectionality, about disability? Which one?
Humanity.
Humanity, that's it. But would a humanitarian actor think at humanity? Probably not. Which one would be? Sorry? Exactly. Are the ones that are often referred to. Why? Because, and more specifically impartiality, because it says something like humanitarian aid should be provided without discrimination based on needs only, right? But humanity would be the key one, because we would be then recognizing disability as part of human diversity, right? So that was an excellent answer. The next policy framework is the Charter on Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities in Humanitarian Action. The Charter is a political initiative, as I said. It was launched during the World Humanitarian Summit 2016, so 2 years ago, as one of these global initiatives, effort, political commitment to change the situation as regards to persons with disabilities. I copied this extract. Again, we recognize the multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination that further exacerbate the exclusion of all persons with disabilities in situations of risk and humanitarian emergencies. It is considering intersectionality. But there are, we were talking about the intersection, about different factors with migration and refugee. So the next framework, policy framework, would be the New York Declaration for Migrants, for Refugees and Migrants, and the Global Compact on Refugee, other big political effort that is undergoing these days. The paragraph copied, particular attention should be paid to the needs of migrants in vulnerable situations who return, such as children, older persons, persons with disabilities, and victims of trafficking. So my feeling, and I see faces in the audience, we stepped back again, right, to needs-based, to vulnerability-based wording. Key issues, well, global policy does not always reflect intersecting factors of discrimination and not following a human-based approach. The potential for change, well, again, IDA is leading a civil society forum to contribute to the design of the Global Compact on Refugees. So there's opportunities to change at least the more practical last step. Guidance, I have to go very quickly there, but well, we have the core humanitarian standards are represented here. Small extract, again, collecting or using data disaggregated by sex, age, and ability to inform programs. That means ability understood as what? As an euphemism for disability is confusing, again. Similar issues we find in the Sphere handbook, which is another handbook that humanitarian actors use for design programs, and the child protection minimum standards. All these are going under revision, good point. They are all changing, shifting the terminology, good point also. But still, well, these are references. Other guidance, I'm displaying the humanitarian inclusion standards for all the people and people with disabilities, starting from an intersecting point of view or entry point, which defines intersectionality in the glossary. I will not go in detail. But key issues there, well, terminologies and approaches can be shifting, but how are standards used? That means by whom, what for, to do what are the standards. And coming to the problem that can these be really considered as quality and accountability frameworks? That means when a country, when an actor, when even an individual is breaking the rule of law, conventions and laws and national level adaptation of these laws that has been shared today can respond, right, with a real accountable action. When we are not in compliance with the standards, what is happening? If we are sincere enough, maybe we won't receive that much funds, but what else, right? So accountability is in question mark. And lastly, participation. Were these processes participative enough? Well, they were involved, I can say that, but persons with disabilities are not within governance bodies of these resources. And that we need to ask why and go to a potential for change. I am displaying the easy-to-read version, draft version, because it's still a draft, of the Interagency Standing Committee guidance for the inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action, which says actually making sure people with disabilities get the rights when war and other problems happen in the world, some new rules to help people know what to do. This is the easy-to-read draft version of the guidelines. That means that it has been developed through, it's being developed now through a consultative and participative process. Why? Well, first, the co-chairing is tripartite. It's the first time that the Interagency Standing Committee is having a tripartite structure, including International Disability Alliance representatives of persons with disabilities as the co-chairs of the development of a global policy. Second, it is, and why is that possible? Because it has been resourced and happened since the very beginning, right? It was one of the, let's say, consequences of the charter or as a result of the launching of that charter that I mentioned before, but of course it considered participation as a key starting point. The process has been that participative that in one of the consultations I was in South America, Rosangela Berman-Wieler from UNICEF, the head of the disability team, was there, and she told me, Ricardo, I was involved in the CRPD development, and I've never seen that participative level of process since then, which is, I think, a very good news. Well, very quickly, other agencies are developing guidance. UNICEF has developed 6 booklets on including children with disabilities in humanitarian action. CBM, is an NGO, has developed a hands-on tool. And other agencies are developing or updating guidance. UNHCR, WFP, ECHO, policy and guidance is reacting to change. But what happens? Well, tools. Can I ask very quickly, tell me one tool you know around disability, a tool, a hands-on, real tool. Very quickly. CRPD is a tool. Can you go to the field? It's a humanitarian worker. Quickly. What tool? One tool. 0 minutes.
Oh.
I'm sorry. I have 2 in my talk. Mobility aids, that's it. But how do we distribute that? How do we access them? For example, identifying people, right? And to identify people, we need good data collection tools. And, for example, sex, age, and disability desegregation is a recommendation all around, and the Washington Group set of questions is the agreed and a standardized way of doing it at global level. There is a project, and I'm running very much, but there is a project that has been launched a couple of years ago to actually demonstrate that the questions can be used in humanitarian action because they were not developed for that purpose in origin, and then developing learning materials based on that. What happens? Yes. The findings say that the prevalence raised 2.36 to 27.55 in UNHCR testing. Okay, so that's a good news. People were saying that invisible disabilities could be identified. And then, but the question is, again, what do they do, humanitarian actors, with the data? People who was involved in the research actually said they didn't know what to do once collecting the data. That means technically it's possible, but the use is not easy. And last, and I want to finalize with this, is the funnel. So I'm representing a funnel, like, you know, these instruments that you use to pour a fluid, a liquid, into a bottle. Is bigger, the entrance, than the exit. We have law at the top, we have policy, we have guidance, but we have poor tools, right? We have poor use of tools. And we have field workers that do not know all the way up to all those tools, etc. So that is what I wanted to say. Potential for change, well, there are other approaches that consider meaningful access, accountability, etc., such as protection mainstreaming, but we need capacity building for humanitarian actors. Okay? Humanitarian actors in the field need training. DPOs in the field need training to become humanitarian actors. Thank you so much for this time.